What if we told you that one of history's most revered spiritual figures was also, well, according to the official story, a notorious imposter who briefly seized an entire empire?
Uh-huh.
Today, we're taking a truly wild deep dive. We're looking into the idea that Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, and this figure known as Gaumata, or Pseudo-Smerdis, might actually be the same person.
It's a theory that really flips things on its head. It doesn't just tweak history, it potentially rewrites a huge chunk of it.
Exactly.
And our mission today, it isn't to say this is fact, not at all, but it is to explore this really compelling, though, let's be clear, highly speculative narrative.
Right.
One that challenges what we thought we knew. We're putting on our detective hats, essentially.
Yeah, definitely.
We'll look at linguistic similarities that are kind of surprising, geographical connections you might not expect, cultural exchanges, and how people are reinterpreting ancient texts.
Yeah.
Like the Behistun inscription, that massive cliff carving by Darius I. Basically his official truth, his PR campaign, you could say.
Wow, yeah.
And also the Dipankara Jataka, that's an old Buddhist tale about the Buddha's past lives. It often holds these metaphorical keys, maybe even historical ones. It could all paint a very surprising picture.
So you're going to get a shortcut today. We'll help you understand the core arguments, the surprising facts, the big historical questions this whole thing raises without getting lost in, dense academic speak.
We'll boil it down.
Yeah, distill it to the key bits. So if we're going to build this pretty audacious case, where do we even start? Let's set the stage first.
Yeah.
Who are these figures traditionally before we start blurring those lines?
Good idea. Okay, traditionally, Gaumata. He's known almost entirely from Darius I's side of the story, etched into that Behistun cliff face.
Right, the official version.
The official version.
Yeah.
Darius says Gaumata was a Magian priest, part of the old Persian priestly class, who snatched the Achaemenid throne in 522 BCE.
How did he supposedly do that?
The story goes, he impersonated Bardia, who the Greeks called Smerdis. Bardia was the son of Cyrus the Great, brother of the ruling king, Cambyses II. Gaumata apparently seized power while Cambyses was off fighting in Egypt. Then, later, Darius and his buddies overthrew him.
Okay.
And other ancient writers like Herodotus and Ctesias, they echo this. They call him a Median magus, really emphasize the deception, and stress he wasn't true Achaemenid royalty.
Got it. So that's Gaumata the imposter. Now, on the other side, totally different character, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. Most people have a rough idea, but let's refresh.
Right. Siddhartha Gautama. Traditionally, he's dated around 563 to 483 BCE, give or take. He was a prince from the Shakya clan, born in Lumbini, which is near the modern border of Nepal and India.
The classic origin story.
Exactly. He famously gave up his princely life, went searching for spiritual truth, and achieved enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya.
And founded Buddhism.
Taught the middle way, the Four Noble Truths, all of that. Early Buddhist texts, like the Pali Nikayas, and later ones like the Mahavastu, they describe his life as this profound spiritual journey.
Okay, so we have these two very distinct traditional narratives. A cunning Persian imposter over here, a revered Indian spiritual leader over there.
Right.
But the core theory we're exploring today, the one that ties them together, it suggests something radical. It proposes Darius's whole story about Gaumata being an imposter. That was deliberate propaganda.
Yeah.
His goal, maybe, was to erase the legacy of a spiritually influential figure who was challenging Persian power and their Zoroastrian religion.
Okay, now that sets the stage for digging deeper. That's a huge motive.
It really does. So if we're looking for the first hints, the first clues that maybe connect these two seemingly separate figures, where do we even begin?
Well, let's start with something that seems almost too simple, but it's actually pretty potent.
Yeah.
The names. Gaumata and Gautama.
They do sound similar.
They really do. The phonetic resemblance is striking. It could point to a shared linguistic root, In those ancient multilingual regions, think Babylon, names shifted around a lot between languages and cultures. It wasn't unusual.
So Gaumata could just be how Persians or Medes said Gautama.
It's possible, a Persian or Median version of the name.
Interesting. Is that it for names, or is there more? You mentioned Buddhist texts potentially holding clues.
Exactly. That Dipankara Jataka, the ancient Buddhist story, it talks about the future Buddha in a past life being called Mega, or sometimes Sumeda.
Okay, Sumida.
Yes, Sumeda. And what's really intriguing is that some scholars see a link between Sumeda and Smerdis.
Samirdis, the Greek name for Bardia, the guy Gaumata supposedly impersonated.
The very same. It hints that maybe, just maybe, these identities got conflated or merged in some early records or traditions.
Yeah.
And it gets even wilder. We have actual physical evidence. Administrative seals found at Persepolis, the heart of the Persian Empire, that literally bear the name Gautama.
I mean, seriously, Gautama stamped on official Persian documents.
Yes, and they're associated with a royal Saka family.
Saka, who were they?
The Sakas, or Sakasithians, were a powerful nomadic group, active across Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia. They sometimes allied with the Persians, sometimes fought them. This finding could potentially link Siddhartha's lineage directly to these Saka people who were right there in the Persian sphere.
So, not just a name similarity, but the Gautama name appearing in Persia linked to royalty.
Exactly. And one specific seal, it's cataloged as PFS 79. It even shows a figure that looks like a sramana, an ascetic, a wandering monk.
Like the Buddha became.
Precisely. It aligns perfectly with Siddhartha's traditional role. So we're moving from just name sounds to actual archaeological ties, showing the Gautama name and related imagery right there in Persia. That really shifts the perspective, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. So if we follow this trail, it's not just names and seals. This theory completely messes with the accepted geography of the Buddha's life, too. What's the idea about where he came from?
Yeah, it's a big shift. Traditional accounts always say Lumbini in Nepal, but some scholars, like Ranajit Pal, they argue he might have actually come from Gamtara or maybe Sistan, Baluchistan.
And where are those?
Those are regions further west, think modern Afghanistan and Takistan, eastern Iran. Crucially, they were definitely within the Achaemenid Empire's sphere of influence back in the 6th century BCE.
Right, in Gaumata's time frame and location.
Exactly. And think about the archaeological finds at Messainak in Afghanistan. It's an ancient site, old copper mines, but also significant Buddhist relics dating way back, possibly to the 6th century BCE.
Wow.
It strongly suggests an early Buddhist presence, or at least proto-Buddhist activity, in areas under Persian influence, long before maybe we thought. It challenges that Nepal-centric story.
Okay.
So the theory suggests Siddhartha, maybe operating as Gaumata, was active in places like Babylon. Babylon was a massive melting pot, Indian ideas, Persian ideas, Mesopotamian ideas, all swirling together.
A real crossroads. And what about the Magi, the Persian priests Darius said Gaumata belonged to? How do they fit in? Were they anything like Indian ascetics?
That's another fascinating connection. The Magi in Media and Persia, they were known for deep-thinking cosmology, spirituality, the nature of reality. A bit like the Indian Sramanas, those wandering philosophers and ascetics seeking truth.
Similar kinds of inquiry.
Yes. Harvey Kraft, another researcher in this area, suggests Siddhartha could have actually joined the Magi order. Maybe he rose through their ranks in Babylon, blending his Vedic background with Mesopotamian wisdom, creating something new, something like a proto-Buddhism.
So this paints Gaumata not as just a political fake, but potentially a spiritual innovator.
Exactly. Which leads to the next point. If we follow this idea, Gaumata wasn't just grabbing a throne. Maybe he was a spiritual leader trying to enact real change. What do we actually know about his short time in power?
Right. Beyond Darius's verse.
Beyond Darius's version. While Darius paints him purely as a usurper, which, again, could be propaganda to justify his own coup, Gaumata's brief rule apparently included some really interesting policies.
Like what?
Things like tax exemptions for people and relief from military service.
Populist measures, definitely. But how does that connect to Buddhism?
Well, think about it. Those policies line up pretty well with core Buddhist ideas. Compassion, nonviolence, easing suffering.
Ah, I see. Reducing the burden of the state.
Precisely. More than that, they suggest a leader may be trying to dismantle the very machinery of empire tribute, conscription. It raises the question, was Gaumata a social revolutionary too? Using his power, however briefly, to lessen suffering in ways that strangely foreshadow the kind of egalitarian communities, the Sanghas, in early Buddhism.
That's a compelling thought.
The theory posits he wasn't an imposter at all. Maybe he was Siddhartha, perhaps claiming power under the name Bardia, leveraging a possible Saka royal connection he had.
And what about Herodotus saying the false Smerdis hid from people who knew the real one?
Right, that's often used as proof of deception. But you could reinterpret it. Maybe it wasn't about hiding a fake identity, but about maintaining a certain spiritual authority, or even an ascetic withdrawal from worldly affairs, which fits perfectly with Siddhartha's later path as a renunciant.
Wow, okay, so he wasn't just taking a throne, he was maybe trying to change the whole system from within, based on spiritual principles. That really reframes him.
It does.
And that leads us straight back to Darius. If Gaumata was this influential, this potentially revolutionary figure, what was Darius's real motive for getting rid of him and burying his legacy so completely?
Excellent question. Darius was a committed Zoroastrian. He likely saw Gaumata's growing spiritual influence, especially if it was this blend of Indian and Persian ideas, as a direct threat,
A threat to what?
both to Achaemenid political control and to the dominance of Zoroastrianism as the state-sponsored religion.
So religious and political motives intertwined.
Absolutely. Think about the Behistun inscription again, carving it so high up, almost inaccessible. It wasn't just for the public. It's just Darius was trying to justify himself to his god, Ahura Mazda, to solidify his own divine right to rule after removing this heretical figure, perhaps?
So branding Gaumata an imposter was the perfect way to erase a rival ideology.
It's a classic political move. Discredit the messenger, erase the message, an ideology blending Indian asceticism with Persian cosmology. That could have been deeply destabilizing. According to this theory, that ideology didn't die, it just moved east.
Meaning, after Darius kicked him out.
Yes. The theory suggests Siddhartha fled eastward, away from Persian power, ended up in India, regrouped, attained enlightenment, and founded Buddhism as we know it, preserving his core teachings in a new context.
Okay, so we have the names, the geography, the potential motive for suppression. What about more concrete clues? Archaeological stuff, textual hints? Are there any smoking guns, so to speak?
Well, smoking gun is always tough in ancient history, right? But those Persepolis seals, like PFS 79 and another one, PFS 796, they are really suggestive.
Tell me more about those.
They consistently link the Gautama family name to the Sakasithians. And the iconography, the images on them, you see things like lion sun shamans, bird-headed figures. These have striking resemblances to later Buddhist motifs.
Like the lion throne.
Exactly like the lion throne, which is so strongly associated with the Buddha. It suggests Siddhartha's family wasn't just some obscure clan, but had real ties to Persia, maybe as important allies or vassals of the Achaemenids.
Okay, that's pretty specific.
And then there's the Mezainek site again, that early Buddhist monastery in Afghanistan. Some scholars think it might have been founded by Trapusa, who, according to Buddhist tradition, was one of the Buddha's very first lay disciples.
Really? And that site is in the Persian sphere.
Smack dab in a region under Persian control during the 6th century BCE. It strongly supports the idea that Siddhartha, or at least his family and very early followers, were active much further west than traditionally thought.
It's fascinating how these threads, the seals, the archaeology, the geography, they keep pointing west towards Persia.
They really do seem to converge.
You mentioned the Dipankara Jataka earlier, too, how it might sort of encode this identity switch. Can you unpack that a bit more? How could a spiritual text act like a hidden history?
Right. That's a crucial piece of this puzzle. The Jataka mentions Megha, or Sumedha, as the Buddha's precursor. The theory is that Sumedha could have phonetically morphed into Smerdis in Greek accounts, becoming the name of the prince Gaumata supposedly impersonated.
So the Buddhist story subtly preserves the connection.
Potentially. The narrative wouldn't just be a fable about past lives. It might be a clever, maybe even deliberate blending of identities. A way to preserve Siddhartha's original story, his Persian connection perhaps, under a different name after he was ousted. Embedding historical truth within a spiritual framework to protect it from being erased by political enemies.
That's actually brilliant. A way to keep the story alive without being obvious.
It's a known technique in suppressed traditions.
Okay, this whole thing sounds like a real mixing of spiritual ideas, especially between what we usually separate as Indian and Persian. What role does Zoroastrianism play in all this? You mentioned it as a threat.
A huge role. Interestingly, Buddhism and Zoroastrianism, they actually share some common ground. Things like ethical dualism, good versus evil, and a big emphasis on truth. It suggests they might have grown out of a shared cultural environment.
Maybe in that very Persian-Indian borderland region.
Quite possibly. The theory proposes that Siddhartha, as Gaumata, was actively engaging with Zoroastrian magi, maybe in Babylon, synthesizing their cosmic ideas with Indian Shramana traditions.
Creating a hybrid spirituality.
Exactly. And Darius's overthrow of Gaumata, that could be seen as a direct backlash against that very syncretism, that blending of traditions. It was a threat to Zoroastrian orthodoxy and the imperial power structure built on it.
And so Buddhism spreading east was a consequence.
It would make sense. It reflects Siddhartha's strategic retreat from Persian persecution, taking his refined teachings to a new, perhaps safer ground in India.
This is an incredibly intricate theory. It hangs together in a really compelling way. But, like all historical theories, especially speculative ones, it must face counter-arguments, right? What are the main challenges? Why do mainstream historians push back?
Absolutely, and it's crucial to consider those. It raises important questions about the evidence. One major issue often cited is the chronology.
The dates don't line up.
Well, the traditional dates for the Buddha, roughly 563 to 483 BCE, and Gaumata's brief reign in 522 BCE, they're close, but not a perfect match for him being Gaumata during that reign.
Right.
However, it's worth noting that scholarly dating of the Buddha is debated. Some revised estimates, based on newer analysis, actually place the Buddha's death much later, maybe closer to 405 BCE.
Oh, that changes things.
It does. It makes an overlap with Gaumata's period of activity, or at least Siddhartha being active around that time in that region, much more plausible. So the dates aren't necessarily a deal breaker, but they require flexibility.
Okay, so the dates aren't insurmountable. What about the historical records themselves? Darius's inscription seems pretty clear, and other ancient historians backed him up.
That's true. Darius's account at Histon, and later Greek writers like Herodotus and Ctesias, they consistently call Gaumata an imposter. That is the dominant historical narrative we've inherited.
So how does the theory counter that?
Proponents argue that this consistency might just reflect successful propaganda. Darius had a very strong motive politically and religiously to delegitimize Gaumata. The Greek historians might have simply relied on Persian sources influenced by Darius's version. It's the classic history written by the victors problem.
Okay, so questioning the source, what about the geography? Shifting Siddhartha from Lumbini to Gandhara or Seistan. That's a massive change to Buddhist tradition.
It is a huge shift, and it directly contradicts centuries of belief and pilgrimage traditions centered on Lumbini. That's a major hurdle. But, as we discussed, the archaeological evidence from places like Messinac, and especially those Persepolis seals, linking the Gautama name and ascetic imagery to Persia and the Sakas, they do offer some compelling, albeit circumstantial, support for a Western origin, or at least significant Western activity. It forces us to at least consider that the geographical heartland of early Buddhism might be more complex than we thought.
So it sounds like the biggest challenge overall, the thing that keeps this theory firmly in the speculative category, is just the lack of that one definitive piece of evidence.
That's the crux of it, yes.
No ancient text explicitly says Gaumata the Magian was Siddhartha Gautama.
Exactly. There's no primary source that makes that direct equation. The theory relies on connecting dots, linguistic links, iconography on seals, reinterpretations of texts and motives. It pieces together fragmented clues. The seals, the Jataka tales, they offer intriguing circumstantial support, absolutely. But it remains a historical puzzle where the pieces seem to fit together in the surprising way, but the final image isn't explicitly drawn for us in any single ancient document we have.
It requires inference, interpretation.
A lot of it. And a willingness to question deeply established narratives.
Okay, so let's try and wrap our heads around this.
Yeah.
What does this all potentially mean for us, listening to this? This theory suggests Siddhartha Gautama, maybe not the Indian prince of legend, but possibly Gaumata, a Saka prince,
Right.
who rises to prominence, maybe even power, in cosmopolitan Babylon, blending Indian and Persian spiritual thought.
And then is swiftly, brutally ousted by Darius Khomasi in what sounds like a coup driven by Zoroastrian orthodoxy as much as political ambition. A clash of ideologies.
After which he flees east, maybe undergoes his enlightenment experience there, and founds Buddhism as we know it, far from Persian influence.
That's the core narrative, yes.
It's a story that hangs on some fascinating linguistic echoes. Those really intriguing seals found in Persia with his family name, and these compelling cultural overlaps between traditions we usually keep separate.
It strongly suggests that Darius's official history, his propaganda, might have deliberately scrubbed Siddhartha's Babylonian or Persian chapter, recasting him as simply an imposter to secure Achaemenid power and Zoroastrian religious dominance.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, what does that tell us?
Well, it suggests that foundational narratives, even the spiritual stories that guide millions, can be profoundly shaped, even manipulated by political power.
Right.
And that what gets passed down as historical truth can be heavily influenced by who held the pen, or in Darius's case, the chisel. It really urges us to look beneath the surface of official histories.
So this theory, even if it stays speculative, it poses a really crucial question, one that goes way beyond just this specific case, doesn't it?
I think so.
How might our whole understanding of history, especially how major religions and philosophies began, change if we consistently interrogated the narratives written by the powerful?
Yeah.
It encourages you, the listener, to maybe reevaluate what you think you know about ancient history, to consider the surprising, cosmopolitan ways ideas might have traveled and transformed across vast empires. And it leaves you with a provocative thought. What other historical imposters might actually be forgotten revolutionaries or spiritual innovators whose stories were deliberately rewritten?